Over the course of the next 72 hours, the fate of diplomacy across an entire continent could shift dramatically, all hinging on a single declaration by the president of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré. At the African Development Summit in Adosaba, in front of hundreds of reporters from around the globe and numerous heads of state, Ibrahim Traoré took a stand seldom witnessed among today's world leaders. He delivered an unequivocal ultimatum to the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. There was no hint of caution or diplomatic vagueness. Staring directly into the lens, Traoré proclaimed, "Mr. Netanyahu, you are given 72 hours to offer an apology to Africa, or you will find yourself unwelcome here." It was not the language of war, it was a declaration of pride, so frank that the entire conference hall was plunged into silence. In mere minutes, footage of this bold moment swept across continents, sparking discussions from Johannesburg to Washington. This was not about a mere disagreement between two political figures. It was about the insistence on respect that Africa now demanded and the sovereignty it would no longer trade away. For those who sense Africa's resurgence has already started, the countdown is on, and the story is far from over. This diplomatic tremor did not originate from a public address. It began, as several diplomatic insiders recount, with a covert revelation. Behind the closed doors of a G7 gathering, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu allegedly made comments that many African leaders deemed deeply insulting, targeting Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso. Reports say he branded them as political opportunists and naive for criticizing Israel's actions in Gaza. Journalists and diplomats later verified that, within those closed circles, the language became even more severe, including terms like crude and militantly theatrical to characterize Africa's reaction. When these revelations came to light, outrage swept African news outlets and social media platforms. On African news, coverage of the scandal dominated the headlines. Within hours, the hashtag Africa is not your pawn was everywhere, generating millions upon millions of shares. Yet, amidst this public uproar, Traoré held his silence, a silence that, in retrospect, appeared meticulously strategic. The moment arrived at the African Development Summit in Adosaba. The hall was filled with dignitaries, delegates, and dozens of international media crews. Ibrahim Traoré approached the podium with no prepared notes, exuding absolute confidence. He opened by reaffirming the innate dignity of each African nation, then paused, fixing his gaze squarely on the camera. "Mr. Netanyahu, this is no contest of shifting alliances. This is a matter of decency. You have 72 hours to apologize, or you shall not be welcome on this continent, neither in trade, nor in diplomacy, nor in the unfolding chapters of history." A stunned hush enveloped the room. Reporters stopped in mid-sentence. Delegates exchanged glances of astonishment. This was not a threat of force, but rather a bold assertion of honor, a direct blow to the power imbalance Africa had endured from the West for decades. In that moment, Burkina Faso transcended its identity as a single West African nation, emerging as the focal point of a worldwide conversation about dignity, sovereignty, and Africa's diplomatic future. Yet, this was merely the beginning. The ripple that followed threatened to upend the global political landscape well beyond Africa's boundaries. The 72-hour clock began ticking the instant Ibrahim Traoré left the stage. Within moments, the entire world was abuzz. Social media sites blazed with discussion from every corner of the continent and far beyond. On Africa News, the story held the front page. The phrase, "Africa is not your pawn," trended across X, TikTok, and Facebook, amassing countless millions of views in just the first 24 hours. The responses extended beyond the digital realm. From government ministries to university lecture halls, the words of Burkina Faso's president were echoed, scrutinized, and lauded. For many Africans, this episode was no ordinary diplomatic spat. It represented a rare, candid act of resistance against decades of marginalization in global decision-making. Waves of support and high-profile endorsements soon followed. South Africa's Foreign Affairs chief shared the widely circulated video, adding the caption, "At last, someone has voiced it." The former Kenyan envoy to the United Nations posted on social media, "This marks the dawn of African diplomacy, undaunted and incorruptible." These remarks resonated deeply, signaling that backing for Traore's position spanned across political and ideological boundaries. In contrast, Israel's official reply remained notably restrained. The office of Prime Minister Netanyahu released a brief, ambiguous denial in just 2 sentences concerning the leaked statements, sidestepping any direct confrontation with Traore's ultimatum. Rather than diffusing the situation, this vagueness only served to intensify it further. Analysts on Africa News suggested the response reinforced a persistent belief. African grievances are too frequently brushed aside instead of addressed through sincere dialogue. By the close of the initial 24 hours, this story had become more than just another headline. It transformed into a call to action, uniting ordinary citizens, diplomats, and political experts alike. For the first time in many years, solidarity among African nations was not theoretical. It was tangible, quantifiable, and pressing. Yet the surge of energy was only beginning, soon spilling from digital platforms onto city streets. The effect of Ibrahim Traore's ultimatum extended far beyond the walls of that conference venue. Throughout Africa, people seized the occasion as both an emblem and a pivotal moment. In Burkina Faso, more than 2,100,000 individuals have been forced from their homes by a violent jihadist uprising, and over 60% of the nation's land is believed to lie outside the central government's reach. Still, President Traoré is widely regarded as the symbol of resistance and the hope for unity. Support for military governance has surged dramatically under his leadership. Recent Afrobarometer findings revealed that 66% of Burkina-based citizens now endorse military rule, a stark rise from only 24% in the year 2012. His assertive challenge to the Israeli prime minister sparked the imagination of youth and rural populations, many of whom see him as a 21st-century Thomas Sankara, a leader determined to restore pride and control to Burkina Faso and the African continent as a whole. Beyond Africa's borders, President Traore's name has become emblematic of bold defiance against foreign political influence. Rallies in his favor erupted not only in Ouagadougou, where thousands shouted, "Long live Captain Traoré," but also in major cities home to substantial African diaspora communities, such as London and Kingston. Demonstrators brandished Burkina Faso's national flag and banners demanding an end to outside meddling in African matters. Inside Africa, analysts highlighted how his domestic policies have reinforced his daring international approach. These policies include taking state ownership of gold mines, establishing Burkina Faso's first gold refinery, and distributing tractors to farmers as part of a national self-sufficiency initiative. However, the journey ahead is fraught with risk. The toll of conflict-related deaths in Burkina Faso has climbed to more than 7,200 over the past year alone, compared to 2,894 prior to President Traoré's rise to power. International human rights watchdogs have cautioned that forced military recruitment, arbitrary arrests, and stifling of political opposition could undermine his support if the government fails to provide peace and economic progress. In this charged environment, President Traoré's 72-hour ultimatum to Prime Minister Netanyahu represented much more than a dramatic diplomatic move. It was a core piece of a wider plan to reinvent African diplomacy on its own terms. For millions, that countdown endures as a powerful symbol, a call for respect, honor, and self-determination that could alter Africa's destiny. The 72-hour ultimatum issued by President Ibrahim Traoré quickly broke the bounds of official diplomatic exchanges, spreading within mere hours of his pronouncement. Across Burkina Faso and throughout the African continent, the winds of political and social change began to blow in unexpected directions. In the heart of Ouagadougou, the capital, public squares transformed into vibrant spaces where citizens gathered to voice their support. Banners soared overhead, emblazoned with slogans like "Africa stands with Ibrahim Traoré" and "Respect Africa," serving as bold declarations of unity. Student organizations from universities in Senegal, Ghana, and Nigeria released joint statements pressing the African Union to officially stand alongside Burkina Faso. Their appeals called for both economic and diplomatic responses against any nation that failed to honor African sovereignty. This surge in civic action unmistakably carried political weight. In places where political involvement had often been subdued by disappointment in leadership, this event rekindled a powerful sense of shared mission. Analysts speaking on African radio programs and television noted that the episode broke through religious, ethnic, and regional barriers. Leaders from Christian-majority countries, Muslim-majority states, and secular governments all echoed the sentiment that the dignity of Africa was not open to compromise. Within Burkina Faso itself, the impact on politics was far-reaching. President Ibrahim Traoré, who had already earned admiration for his nationalist ideals and economic changes, watched his popularity rise dramatically in the days after issuing the ultimatum. Figures from opposition parties who had once criticized his military-driven leadership found themselves facing a dilemma. Continuing their opposition now risked making them appear unsupportive of the nation during a period of rare unity. The African Union, frequently accused of slow crisis response, launched urgent internal discussions. Although no formal resolution was immediately made public, sources suggested that several member countries were preparing to advocate for a collective diplomatic action if the 72-hour window closed with no apology from Prime Minister Netanyahu. At the same time, some commentators warned that the elevated public hopes could become a liability if concrete diplomatic results did not materialize, possibly leading to renewed disillusionment. For now, however, the prevailing spirit of unity and resolve could not be missed, and it was reshaping politics in ways that seemed irreversible. Beyond the immediate display of togetherness, President Ibrahim Traoré's ultimatum sparked more profound debates about Africa's structural position in global politics. Legislators in several parliaments introduced proposals to reevaluate bilateral trade deals with Israel, insisting that any partnership lacking mutual respect should be reconsidered. The governments of South Africa, Namibia, and Tanzania signaled their readiness to back a continent-wide review of diplomatic priorities if the 72-hour deadline passed without a formal apology. This incident also motivated regional blocs to rethink their collective strength. The Economic Community of West African States, previously dedicated mainly to economic coordination and resolving conflicts, began exploring the possibility of adopting a more forceful stance in foreign affairs. The underlying principle was clear and compelling. African nations ought to act in concert not just in economic matters, but also in defending their political dignity and international standing. Within Burkina Faso, the social impact was just as profound. Communities previously divided by internal strife discovered unity in the symbolism of the president's stance. In villages marked by insurrection, local leaders noted that the ultimatum served as a reminder that their hardships were woven into the broader struggle for African self-determination. For families uprooted and residing in makeshift camps, the address transformed into a collective moment of pride. It became a tale recounted by flickering firelight and within packed, improvised shelters. Yet, this surge in political energy brought with it certain hazards. Global organizations discreetly voiced apprehension, warning that Burkina Faso's intensifying, combative stance in foreign affairs might drive away investment or trigger penalties from Western-aligned coalitions. Diplomatic representatives from nations across Europe and North America privately sought meetings with President Traoré's inner circle. Their goal was to determine whether Burkina Faso planned to take the confrontation further than mere symbolism. Nevertheless, throughout Africa, the episode was widely regarded as a striking display of unyielding leadership. Major news networks across the continent highlighted not just the boldness of the ultimatum, but also the calculated composure that followed. President Ibrahim Traoré offered no additional statements to the press, fostering an air of suspense and shifting the responsibility for a reply squarely onto Prime Minister Netanyahu. By the end of the 72 hours, it was unmistakable that no matter the immediate outcome, Africa's political terrain had been irrevocably altered. The ultimatum set new standards for diplomatic behavior toward African nations, presenting a vivid illustration of what it means for the continent to speak as one. When the 72-hour deadline was declared, the reverberations extended far beyond Africa's borders. The impact was felt in the corridors of authority in Washington, Paris, Moscow, and Beijing. For the United States, long accustomed to quieter African diplomacy, the pronouncement from President Ibrahim Traoré served as a powerful reminder that leaders from the continent could shape international discourse on their own terms. Political commentators in America debated the event with intensity. Some voices in Washington labeled the move as reckless, anxious it might complicate essential alliances. Others, especially among a new wave of African-American intellectuals and activists, lauded it as a pure assertion of sovereignty. On university campuses nationwide, from Howard University to the University of California, students convened forums not only to analyze Traoré's words, but to celebrate the bravery behind them. In New York City, members of the African diaspora congregated in Harlem. Bearing both the Stars and Stripes and the flag of Burkina Faso, they chanted together, "Africa stands tall." Their message was not one of severing global partnerships, but rather of insisting those relationships be founded on mutual regard. Across the world, reactions exposed pronounced divides. In Moscow and Beijing, state-run outlets cast Ibrahim Traoré as a champion against Western influence. European leaders opted for a cautious approach, eschewing outright condemnation while advocating for constructive conversation. In the Middle East, opinions were split, with some decrying the escalation and others quietly applauding its audacity. Yet, among many witnesses, there emerged a shared recognition. The president of Burkina Faso had altered the very rules of engagement. He did not seek validation, he claimed it. He did not request a place at the table, he declared that Africa possesses its own table. For millions throughout Africa and beyond, this moment transcended the words of a single leader. It represented, perhaps for the first time in generations, an African head of state standing before the international community, unbowed and resolute. It was an image of dignity that neither adversaries could erase nor allies overlook. As the last moments of the 72-hour countdown ticked away, Burkina Faso commanded the world's gaze. To countless Africans, this was more than a diplomatic challenge. It was a trial of whether Africa's voice could demand immediate respect at the summit of global decision-making. In Washington, certain members of Congress quietly conceded that the United States could no longer assume African silence as a given. Behind closed doors, strategists in foreign affairs wrestled with a pressing question. Was Ibrahim Traoré simply a fleeting figure, or did he embody a rising wave of African leadership, one that refused to seek approval before standing up for the honor of its people? Across the African diaspora, from the streets of Chicago to gatherings in Atlanta, Traoré's name was spoken not as that of a remote politician, but as proof that African leaders could be both principled and unafraid. To many, he echoed the giants of history who had refused to yield, standing tall beneath the weight of tremendous pressure, a living testament that courage can spark courage in others. As the clock marked the 48th hour within the 72-hour countdown, a subtle transformation began to unfold. Whispered reports made their way through diplomatic channels. The government of Israel had begun reaching out quietly to several African capitals, seeking private talks to ease mounting friction. There were no press releases, no official confirmations, just discreet notes relayed by trusted intermediaries, signaling a readiness to resolve misunderstandings behind the scenes. In Addis Ababa, where the African Union's headquarters stand, senior officials interpreted these overtures not as capitulation, but as proof that the ultimatum was yielding results. For years, African leaders had grown accustomed to having their requests delayed, sidestepped, or outright ignored. But now, the very fact that secret negotiations were underway before the deadline even closed was seen as a triumph. Within Burkina Faso, news of these developments spread rapidly, carried by word of mouth, radio reports, and animated debates at public forums. The message could not have been clearer. President Ibrahim Traore's resolute stance had compelled one of the world's most influential leaders to reconsider both words and deeds. The symbolism was powerful. No longer was Africa simply defending its reputation. It was shaping the global conversation. For the first time in decades, the scales of influence tipped, even if just a little, toward Africa. And this shift was not the result of military force or economic threats, but rather a bold and unyielding insistence on dignity. Such a moment held the power to inspire not just a single nation, but an entire continent. When the final day dawned, there was no formal apology from Prime Minister Netanyahu. Yet, what unfolded was even more telling. Across the continent, leaders who had once hesitated to align themselves with Traore's defiant rhetoric began to mention his name with admiration in their public statements. Even in countries where ties to Israel ran deep, officials privately conceded that his actions had raised the bar for African diplomacy. The real revelation was not whether an apology came, but what the 72-hour ordeal had uncovered. That one steadfast voice could reshape how a continent was seen. By refusing to waver, Traoré had done more than defend Burkina Faso. He had entered the company of leaders who leave a lasting mark on history. For millions who watched, the message rang out unmistakably clear. Africa need not wait for invitations to the tables of global power. Africa builds its own table, and those who wish to join must come with respect. In the end, the 72-hour ultimatum became much more than a political episode. It became a mirror, reflecting Africa's true strength back at itself. Ibrahim Traoré, leader of Burkina Faso, had stood before the world and demanded respect, not as a plea, but as the very foundation of dialogue. The resulting shockwaves reached every part of the continent. From farmers working the fields of Burkina Faso to students in Nairobi, from vendors in the bustling markets of Accra to community figures in Johannesburg, pride surged anew. People remembered that sovereignty is not a gift, but something to be claimed and protected. This was not a tale of aggression, but of dignity, a declaration that no nation, no matter its power, holds the right to belittle another. Traore's message struck a deep chord, imbued with the legacy of generations of Africans who had persistently struggled for liberation, fairness, and equal rights. In Traore's own stirring words, freedom is not something for which we seek approval. It is something we demand, rising up to embrace it ourselves. If the courage of Ibrahim Traoré has moved you, spread this narrative. Subscribe so that Africa's voice rings out with power and purpose, not as a distant reverberation, but as a driving force. May the grace of God watch over Africa.